Chris Ringland, thank you so much for joining me today. How have you been? How are you going?
Yeah, we're going pretty good, Tom. It's an interesting time of the year. It's the most stressful time of the year because the season's evolving, the vineyards are starting to grow, and we're trying to get our heads around what the upcoming vintage is going to be like. And this has been a particularly complicated, unexpectedly complicated. Everyone was saying there might be a La Nina, and we might have a negative dipole in the Indian Ocean, and we might have an impact from the Antarctic vortex, which appears to have been a new thing that they've just invented to mess us all around even further.
Yep.
And of course, they're all conspiring to create a cooler, much wetter and much milder build-up after an extremely wet winter. And we've had probably, even though the guys in Queensland and New South Wales on the coast and internally have had one of the wettest seasons in more than a century, we're also experiencing unprecedentedly wet conditions in the last month.
Is it cool down where you are? Sorry, because at here at the moment, I could slice the air with a knife. It is so thick. It is so humid. There's been an awful lot of rain. Everything is looking emerald green. So that's the beautiful part. But what sort of effect is that having on the ground down where you are?
It's been unusually cool. So the next few days are back to early autumn temperature conditions. We've had little brief periods of normal warm conditions, but they are only lasting 2 or 3 days. So yeah, in my experience, we are entering into a classic South Eastern Australia La Nina pattern. It's certainly showing in the vineyards now. And of course, on October the 28th, a very powerful thunderstorm band came across this part of South Australia, and a hailstorm almost completely destroyed my 2022 crop. Most incredible hailstorm I have ever seen, and I've seen a few.
Yep. Okay.
So my normal yield has been reduced, I reckon, by at least 80%. The vines are slowly starting to recover. The weather conditions in the week after that storm front were unbelievably cold. In fact, it sleeted up at my vineyard for a day, which is...
Wow. You don't normally hear about that. Yeah.
Not in November. The vineyard is now recovering, and interestingly, old vines and vines generally recover quite rapidly from a hail damage event, because it's essentially like a sort of a rather crude early summer pruning event. The vines are starting to grow new shoots. I'm spraying them with composted worm castings and kelp to feed them through the leaves, and they love it. They're recovering. But there's not going to be any fruit.
Yeah,
I can do now for this coming season. I can just make sure the vines are recovering and happy, and setting up some good growth material so that maybe I'm going to get a good 2023.
Yeah.
So 2022, I've given the vines the year off.
Okay. Maybe that's something you can ask Santa Claus going into Christmas.
Yeah.
Dude, what's going on at the Ringland estate for Christmas? Busy period. You got much coming up? Celebration-wise, end of the year?
No, it's normally pretty quiet. Obviously Ringland Vintners, North Barossa Vintners, this is always our busiest time of the year because people are getting their pre-holiday season wine orders in domestically, and also we're actually preparing major wine orders for shipment to our customers in the United States and in Europe. So interestingly, they like to ship in the winter, which is actually good from a temperature control point of view. So yeah, the crew are flat out actually packaging and preparing wines for export order. Christmas, New Year's, short period of relaxation because we bump straight back into it in early January to get ourselves ready for vintage. And we've got a few blends to get into before a vintage starts, and we've still got a straggling group of 2021 wines still going through Malo. We then have to rack and get them cleaned up and ready for a long-term barrel storage. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing routine. We're quite used to a relatively brief Christmas, New Year break. I've got a 100-year-old Jarrah cabin cruiser down at Hindmarsh Island in Goolwa, and I'll go down there whenever I can for getting a bit of cruising in.
Yep.
But you just do what you can do.
That's it. That sounds delightful. Get away, enjoy the cruise, and come back better than ever. And that's saying something coming from you, given everything you've achieved. That's what I want to talk about. So, Chris Ringland, the world knows about the wine. The world knows about how much Robert Parker Jr. thought about the work you've done. But I'm very interested in talking about all those things. I want to start with your story. Every story has a beginning. Going back to New Zealand, Chris Ringland, where did it all start? Did you have this passion for wine? It's very unusual in my experience for a very young kid to come out of the womb, grow up and go, gee, I want to be a winemaker. What was it like? What was it like for you?
Yeah, good question, mate. My mum's family emigrated from Denmark into New Zealand just before World War II. Mm-hmm. And my dad came over just after. And I grew up in South Auckland in New Zealand during the 1960s. And our collective families being relatively European, we drank beer, we drank wine, but we weren't wine-centric, but it was all part of the deal during the 1960s, and wine started to become a bit of a thing because the New Zealand wine industry started to, really kick in. Mm-hmm. But I was, as a kid, very interested in science. And the whole reason that I started doing little experiments at home during school holidays was actually doing little experiments with doing fermentations purely from a scientific point of view. I actually came across a home winemaking book that my mum and dad had just in their book collection. And it was, the English were really into home winemaking after World War II because it was a time of austerity and there was disruptions in the supply of wine from Europe. And the English decided to make wine at home from fruit, whatever you can do. And they published some pretty cool books on the subject. And they were really good, very straightforward, almost like home winemaking manuals. Mm-hmm. And so I was fascinated by the detail of this. And I thought, give it a go. Just see what happens. And so we had fruit that was available locally in terms of plums and blackberries and all sorts of stuff. So I decided to have a bit of an experiment, just see how it went, actually making little batches of wine. And then, of course, everybody in South Auckland during the 1960s had a grapevine in the backyard. It was just a thing. Okay. But more often than not, the grapes either got eaten or the rest of them just got attacked by birds or fell on the ground. So I discovered that there was a big surplus of backyard grapes in my immediate suburban area. So that's when I recruited my schoolmates to help me go around in the afternoons after school and pick the grapes, load them into wheelbarrows, because of course we couldn't drive. And then we'd wheelbarrow them around, and I set up a little winery in the basement of Mum and Dad's place, and I made a little crusher.
How old were you at this stage, Chris? Just painting more of a picture.
14.
14. Okay, go on.
Yeah. And then we all managed to, using me pocket money, organised to buy some barrels, which we sawed in half to use as fermenting tubs. We bought the barrels off a wine merchant in Auckland. My mum drove me in to get the barrels, and a whole $10 for a barrel. That was a big investment. Yep. Sawed the barrel in half, made it into fermenting tubs, and then of course bought extra barrels because I knew I'd have to ferment the wine and store the wine in a barrel. And then of course our bottles. I just went around all the people and all the locals who were drinking wine and collected all their empty bottles, brought them round to my folks' place, set up in the laundry, soaking the bottles, washing the bottles, creating my own supply of bottles, then going to a home brew supplied to buy corks, and just being able to work out. I didn't understand you couldn't just buy bottles. I thought if I want bottles, I'm going to have to get empty bottles from people and soak the labels off, wash them. The first batches of wine basically were bottled into a pretty eclectic collection of empties. Yep. It was actually, mate, I was a pioneer of recycling, if you don't mind, mate.
You were indeed. You kicked off the whole sustainability movement. What haven't you done, Chris?
Yeah, it was purely because I didn't know any other way of doing it. Where was I going to get bottles from?
Yeah. Now,
So,
can I just ask, what incentive did your friends have to help you out on something like this? They just loved you to bits, and anything Chris asks for, we're going to do. Were you paying them under the table, or they were just as keen about the idea of backyard fermentation as you were?
I think they thought it was a pretty interesting project, but the deal was their parents were going to get a few bottles of wine.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's how I got into it. I divvied the wine up amongst the people that I got the grapes off.
Yep.
And the families of my friends who actually helped me out. And so the wine actually came out rather good.
So at the age of 14, you were making drinkable wines in your backyard.
Yeah, I was following the rules. I studied up the science. I knew exactly what to do with racking, using SO2. Couldn't control the fermentation, but it was Auckland. It wasn't exactly that hot. So the wine actually came up quite good, and the parents and the neighbours bloody delighted that there were these half decent bottles of wine coming out of the basement of Mum and Dad's place. Yep. So it was an experiment that turned into actually a rather good practical, exercise in making a bit of home wine.
Mm-hmm.
Then I discovered that you could actually study winemaking, and the New Zealand Department of Scientific and Industrial Research had a viticultural research station about 100k further south at Te Kaupara. And I made contact with them and went and visited them. And they basically indicated that with what I was doing and my interest, that I should apply to the University of South Australia to study wine science. So that was the next step.
That was what brought you over the ditch.
Yeah, exactly. But basically, I knew I had to graduate from high school. Mm-hmm. And during that process, I wrote letters to the SATAC, the South Australian Admissions, basically explained what I was doing, what my intentions were, and they wrote back and said, "You're in."
Wow. Okay.
I didn't realise it was going to be that bloody easy, actually. But that's how
you took a chance and it paid off. A little bit of initiative goes a long way sometimes. So you really knew you wanted to be a winemaker, and a good winemaker at a very young age.
I just realised if you could study the science of something like that, and there was a place you could do it, it sounded like a pretty good opportunity. And I was brought up in a generation that believed that if you could do so, that obtaining a tertiary education and qualifications in a subject would probably set you up for the long term. My parents' generation, emerging from World War II and realising that with uncertainty in the world, sometimes it pays to study something and get a bit of qualification, and that can, put you in good stead in the future. So essentially, I just thought, well, that's the way to do it. And it turned out it was actually, it was the way to do it. Back in the 70s and the 80s, New Zealand and Australia had a cooperative agreement. So if you were a graduate of high school in Australia or New Zealand, you were eligible to apply to university in either country. Mm-hmm. Pretty damn good agreement, actually, because New Zealanders could study in Australia in fields that weren't available in New Zealand. And of course, a hell of a lot of young Australians came down and studied things like mining technology in Otago, which was considered probably the finest mining qualification in the world. So it was a mutual beneficial. So I was a benefit of that. So essentially, as a young student, a tertiary student in Australia, I was treated like an Australian citizen.
Yep.
There were I had tuition fees, but everything else it was as if I was studying in New Zealand. It's bloody brilliant. All I had to do is pay for my airfare to get over and back, which wasn't that hard. I took a job in a pickle factory for a year after graduating to earn the extra money to be able to fund getting to and from.
Hard work.
Mum and Dad. And it was actually a bit scientific-y as well. And actually it was quite interesting because pickling's like a strange sort of variation on the whole winemaking process. It's all pickling in the end. And my mum and dad said, every dollar that you save and earn for this will match you. With that collaborative agreement, I had good resources to get myself into another country, studying and living. So it worked very well.
Chris Ringland, the industrious. So it really sounds to me like from that age, you started getting involved in wine too, entering into that collaborative arrangement with your parents. Wine is really taking front and center place. It's absorbing a lot of your time. Did you have a life outside of wine? That sounds funny asking a kid that, but did you hobbies on the side, or did you just set your eyes on that prize from a young age and go, this is where I'm going? All efforts that way.
No, plenty of hobbies on the side.
Yeah.
Growing up in South Auckland and growing up in Auckland in the 1960s and 70s, being our whole family's hobby was sailing.
Mm-hmm.
And any spare time we had, we were either at the beach or out sailing on yachts. So we had plenty of activities to occupy us. But I must admit, in the 60s and 70s in New Zealand, practically everybody was out on the water.
Yeah.
It's just the nature of Auckland. So yeah, there was plenty of other stuff going on, but wine was it's interesting, the way that wine became a very interesting phenomenon in New Zealand in the 60s and 70s. The Dalmatians had established, the Dalmatian immigrants from Yugoslavia had established grape growing as an alternative form of horticulture, and it really started capturing attention. And the vineyards actually seemed to be pretty damn good, and the wines were good. And people started enjoying wine. It was a lifestyle thing. It was a nice, civilized alternative to beer. It was certainly a civilized alternative to drinking spirits. And it became a big thing. And interestingly, when I was studying here in Australia, New Zealand was still going through a transition from being a very pre-1950s wine industry that was focused on making fortified wine, and the growers started realizing that table wine was going to be the thing of the future. And by the time I graduated and went back to work in New Zealand, we were going through the transition from it being a fortified wine industry to starting making red wine. And then, of course, the huge change was when somebody decided to plant Sauvignon Blanc down in Marlborough, and New Zealand suddenly went from being just doddering along as a quaint little wine industry in the Southern Hemisphere to being put on the world map.
Mm-hmm.
as people started noticing these Sauvignon Blancs that started coming out of Marlborough during the early 1980s. And so it was an interesting transitional time. The wine industry went from being a quaint European-esque activity to suddenly becoming internationally mainstream, and New Zealand was actually kicking goals around the world, and suddenly the wine industry started becoming, hey, this is serious.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very fortunate to be, part of that process. We needed scientifically trained winemakers who knew what they were doing when it came to actually how to do things in a winery and how to look after wines.
Mm-hmm.
So I, without actually planning it, I was suddenly found myself in an extremely favourable position in terms of the options, that were available.
Mm-hmm. And you crossed over to Oz. And if I can just ask you, what was going on in Australia at that time? So you've just spoken about that initial flourishing of the New Zealand wine industry. Do you recall what was going on in Australia in terms of the development of their wines?
The thing that actually got me back to Australia was actually just getting on the flying winemaker adventure tread. I loved it in New Zealand and it was really exciting. But I discovered that a lot of my mates who graduated from Roseworthy at the same time were starting to actually get vintages in California, South Africa, Europe. And I realized that I could actually get on that. So this was a combination of adventure and using what you'd been trained to do to be able to travel the world. And when you're in your early 20s, it sounds pretty damn good, doesn't it? I made contact with mates back in South Australia and got myself a vintage in the Barossa, and that vintage provided the funding for me then to bounce across to do vintage in California, then travel through and visit winemaking areas in France, hang out with mates in the UK, get back to Australia in January, get ready and do another vintage. And for several years, you just find new adventures and keep traveling. And the other great thing is you're gaining experience.
Yeah.
You're gaining international experience. And the other interesting thing that a lot of my contemporaries, myself included, discovered as part of that process, you also eventually lodged somewhere where an opportunity arises, and it's with what you've done, with what you're doing, you want to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next stage of your career develops. I was inadvertently part of a very exciting process, and it worked very well.
So yeah, you're building
And
this
for,
resume with all your travel, and that just the comments, that was one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about, I guess, my own wine education is it's that window into different cultures, different places, histories. And I am not nearly as well traveled as I would like to be. I've been to a few different places, but my resume is very narrow compared to some. And so I started flicking through a lot of my old man's wine books and going, hey, hang on, I'm moving through Europe. I'm moving through South America, Australia. I'm learning all about the different places in South Australia. And I go, not that I never want to travel, but I could just sit here for hours flicking through. I'm reading about geography. I'm reading about history. I'm reading about culture. And then I get to read about wine. And it's just this really colorful world that I found very appealing. And I think a lot of other people do. Is that a very important part of it from your perspective?
Absolutely, mate. But what's interesting is when you're in the winemaking business, whether you're a viticulturist or you're winemaking, you're living in beautiful rural locations,
mm-hmm.
and you're actually becoming immersed in the local culture at the same time. So I must admit, I loved my time in California. It was, and it was a really interesting time in California during the mid-'80s. California was developing to the next stage. I met a lot of very interesting people. Looking back at it, a lot subsequently would have become really famous people, but of course we're all starting out.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great grounding. Being able to go to Europe and actually visit some of the key places that we'd always learned about as being incredibly important was quite inspirational. But for me, of course, coming back to the Barossa provided that next incredible opportunity when doing a pruning contract during the winter before kicking into the next vintage. Rob O'Callaghan called me one morning to ask me to give him a hand, because he knew that I was what I was doing, and I lived up the road, and he was in a difficult position, and he maybe said, "Can you come down and finish this blend for me? I've got to go down and sort some stuff out with the kids who were at school in Adelaide." And of course, I'm going to come down and help you. I used to drop in and catch up with him in Cellar Door on the way home from pruning and talk about what was going on. And I just went down and he showed me what was going on. I finished the blend.
So how did you meet him? Because he's a bit of a rock star in the wine world, Rockford, massive name. Where did that relationship start?
Lived on a property up the road. Used to drop into Rockford on the way home, have taste a few wines, have a chat. Just it developed from there. There was quite an interesting network of young winemakers and people socialising around at that time, and it was a very interesting time in the Barossa. Before the next big boom occurred, the Barossa was just a quiet little place where the primordial seeds of a lot of the really exciting wineries were actually just starting to form, So it was just, again, mate, it was right place, right time.
Okay.
I answered the phone at the right time on a morning and said yes, went down, did the job, and I was doing the job for the next 18 years.
How good is that?
So
he gave you an opportunity.
It was a good opportunity.
Yeah, he gave you an opportunity. You took it. But something that's come to recently meet a number of different people in the wine industry, and they're also bloody friendly. Yourself included, and talking to Nathan, who works very closely with you. I'm just in awe of collegiate is too formal a word. You're just down to earth, you're friendly, you're generous. Is that an accurate depiction of the wine industry? Everybody willing to help each other out? Or am I just looking at it through some, rose-colored glasses? What's going on?
Certainly in the stage when things were kicking off in the late 80s and the early 90s, a lot of the new little startups were collaborating. For example, Charlie Melton would ring us up and go, "Look, I've got a problem here. My pump's just broken down. I'm in the middle of a blend. I'd just put one of our pumps on the back of the ute and drive up and drop it off.
Help a brother out.
We'd share equipment. It was all part of the deal." One of the things I like to remind the young people these days is a lot of the reason that it works like that is because it is actually the entertainment business. We're not, and there's two ways of looking at this. If you look at it as if you're competitors, it's not really in the spirit of the way the wine industry really works. You're not competitors. It's like saying that one singer is competing with another singer. I know, okay, I'm not dressing it up to say that we're all that artistic, but we are entertaining people, and you're collaborating and you're enjoying yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the fun. So if you look at it like that, you've got to help each other out. It's hardly as if one, say, recording artist is going to try and exclude another one because they're competing for ticket sales. They're not. People want the breadth of experience, and with wine, people want the breadth of an interest in wine experience. We collaborate and we work together because we're all working for a common cause,
mm-hmm.
making bottles of fun. Because I've got to tell you, if it's not a bottle of fun, what's the bloody point?
I like that. Amen.
There's plenty of other things to drink. You've got to make it compelling, exciting, interesting, and delicious. And that's one of the things you have to start learning. But working with Robert for those formative years was fundamentally important. I'd never made on that level, I'd never made red wine. In New Zealand, we were making white wines. As a cellar hand, I was just doing whatever was needed to get the job done. But at least I had an understanding of the rigor of how to operate in the cellar. I had the science background to know the actual nuts and bolts of what needed to be looked at and what could go or could not go wrong. And of course, when it came to practical day-to-day winemaking, it's a great combination. I can't say that you can ever be an overqualified cellar hand, because it's pretty good qualification, and I was doing shit kicker work, and yet I was enjoying the hell out of it.
Yeah,
because it was extremely good work, extremely rewarding work. It was a great time, and it was we were making wonderful wines, and we were getting really good following, and it was just building a beautiful reputation and environment. So it was, again, I look back at it and go, I'm so pleased. I recognised it was an opportunity. I took off a big bloody bite and I chewed like crazy.
Yep.
Because that's what you've got to do. You've got to recognise when opportunities present themselves in life and realise that you've got to focus on this, because this could be the thing that sustains you,
mm-hmm.
through your career. And that's what happened.
I've got to ask you about the Rockford basket press Shiraz. So people rave about that wine. I assume rightly. What does that wine mean to you?
Rob sort of had an understanding about how that wine was going to be, and that was based on his history as a winemaker at Seppelts in the 50s and the 60s, and it was actually a pretty solid grounding about that beautiful old-fashioned soft red that had the ability to age. And of course, he put together this crazy collection of antique equipment at Rockford. And I don't know, when I first started working for them, even I thought, oh, this is just some sort of set of equipment that we're going to use for show to make it look cool when people come into Cellar Door. And of course, I rapidly realised, no, this is what we're actually going to do to make all the wine. The slate fermenters, the Robinson basket press, the Bagshaw crusher, the Kaesler engine, single cylinder piston engine firing the whole unit. This whole thing was 100-year-old throwback.
Yeah.
And it was what we did every day. And it was actually, in the end, obviously very rapidly, I realised not only was it what we were going to do, but it was a hell of a lot of fun.
Yep.
And it was something that actually taught me how to hand make wines. These parcels of Shiraz were being very gently made into wine. And I very rapidly worked out the techniques that Rob showed me, how we were going to gently coax the wine out of those little fermenters. And there's a collection. But there are two ways you can make a wine. You can make, like I do, you can make an individual vineyard that's a single vineyard statement, or you can make a wine that's a regional, varietal, how can I put it, a style. So basket press contained as many as 30 different vineyards, 30 different Shiraz vineyards from different sub-regions of the Barossa. But it was Rockford's house style. Each of those vineyards was picked when it was deemed to be ready, fermented separately, matured separately, and then all of the barrels were carefully evaluated, which was my job. And then we actually created a blend, and that became the Rockford blend. And of course, it was the Rockford basket press because we were using a basket press. So the basket press created these lovely soft pressings. And then Rob taught me about the fact that you don't rush the whole process, let the wines gently mature and at that stage, seasoned oak. New oak was really expensive. So the new oak component in a wine like that was barely 10%, maybe 20% later on. And so funnily enough, back in the late 80s, funnily enough, Rob was actually predicting something that actually became a very important part of the style maybe 15, 20 years later. But it was partly because of his philosophy about the style, and it was a style that was an evolution from the early pioneering winemaking in the Barossa and in Victoria in the post-gold rush era. But also it was because we couldn't afford to buy all this new fancy oak. So you were actually doing what you could to make sure your wines came through with the resources that you had, both labour, logistical and financial. And it all came together, and the wine started to get a following. People started coming up to the Barossa, and Rockford was a destination. The Cellar Door was a place where you had to go to Rockford Cellar Door. Yep. You had to go to St Helier. It was part of the journey, and it gradually took off, and it became very exciting.
It's an absolutely stunning wine, and I'm going to assume that you learnt an awful lot from that process and you implemented that in how you started making your red wines moving forward. Because I think the story goes that, correct me if I'm wrong, at some stage, Rob called you over and drew a bit of a square and said, Chris, I'm going to give you this. You're showing so much promise that you can start playing around in here. And that was, he gave you a section of his playing field, and you took that and started working your own magic in it. And that turned into Three Rivers, more or less.
Actually, it's the other way around.
Help me out.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
No,
okay.
Yeah, fortunately, it happened very early in the piece in 1989. And I actually went to Rob and said, look, I've been offered a little parcel of grapes and I want to do a little experiment of my own. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? Obviously, I asked his permission straight up because I didn't want to create any conflict. And he said, yep, I'll let you do it. No more than 1 tonne. It can't interfere with your day-to-day, but okay, this is okay, you can do it. So with that permission, I started doing it as a little after-hours project. And that's where it started. I had plenty on my plate, so it was never going to actually get much more than that because I had lots going on. It was vintage at Rockford at that stage because it was so hands-on. I'd have a couple of cellar hands helping me. But there were years like 1991, that vintage went for 16 weeks, 7 days a week.
Yep.
Sometimes 16 hours a day. It was hectic. It was all manual. And I was young enough and eager enough and stupid enough to do it and have a bloody ball.
Yep.
This is the grounding that you actually go through. In the course at the time, you just do it. And then you look back at it and go, no, actually, that was rather a good grounding. Mm-hmm. So that's how it goes. But I gradually just quietly chugged away at my little after-hours project, and other opportunities arose with parcels of grapes that were available. And you should be aware that in the early 90s, Shiraz grape prices were very low. The industry actually emerged into the 90s in actually a bit of a slump. I think we had a mini recession. And I was able to buy really good old vine Barossa Shiraz for $500 a tonne, mm-hmm. which is, in the modern context, ridiculously low. But that was the nature of the time. And then in 1994, somebody pointed out to me that there was this vineyard for sale up in Flaxlands Valley, and I actually didn't have any plans or intention of buying a vineyard or a property, but it piqued my interest, and I went up and had a look on a Sunday afternoon and jumped the fence and had a look at the vines and thought, these vines are pretty damn good. Interesting potential. Spoke to Rob about it the next morning, and before I could even get another word in, we were in the car driving back down to have a look at it.
Yep.
He had a look. He reckoned it was a pretty good vineyard and indicated to me that he would write a document outlining Rockford's intention to purchase half the fruit as a contract if I acquired the property. I presented that document to my bank manager, and I had enough money saved to pay a deposit on the property. And 6 o'clock the Monday that evening, I received a phone call saying that I just bought a vineyard, which was a bit shocking, because then my first thought was, oh, now I have to prune the bloody thing. So that was my project for the whole winter, was pruning my own vineyard.
Yep.
So
you've done it to yourself.
And there was an old stone cottage on the property, and I moved into that during the winter. But yeah, the next project was pruning back and rejuvenating a 110-year-old vineyard that had been a little bit neglected for a while.
110 years old. So if we're talking about old vine, etc., as opposed to new, what to you would constitute old vine? Old vine Grenache, old vine Shiraz. How old does something have to generally be to be old?
In the Barossa, there are parcels going back to, still surviving parcels going back to the 1840s, 1850s.
That's
so
old.
we've got some incredible old parcels of vines.
Mm-hmm.
For me, for me personally, anything more than 50 years old. I don't know, there's a Barossa Old Vine Charter. I don't know what their parameters are. I have my own personal gauge. More than 50 for me qualifies.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a personal thing. I don't know how it relates to any official.
The impact on the wine is real. So people talk about older vines, deeper roots, more access to the raw materials down there that add the complexity, etc., to the wine. That's real. If you see a wine on the shelf that's old vine, well-made, reputable winemaker, get your hands on it.
Plant adapts to its environment. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's a little tree, and the longer it grows, the more adapted it becomes to its environment,
Mm-hmm.
and you can actually see it in not only in the way the plant grows, its consistency from season to season. It's got the resources to ride through the unusual characteristics that a year may present, because it's been in the ground for that long. So old vine, old vine is it's not just a longevity thing, it's an environmentally stable thing. The vine is a plant that actually is capable of, especially in South Australia, we don't need to graft onto rootstock. And as soon as you graft onto rootstock, you're actually immediately limiting the maximum age of that combination. And so own-rooted vines can go for hundreds of years in the right environment if you look after them. And the Barossa is actually setting itself up as one of the key regions in the world where that's going to be the case. I'm regularly seeing 250-plus-year-old vineyards in Spain. And that's because, of course, it's Spain. Here in the Barossa, we're going to achieve the same thing. And especially now in this new environment, new generation, where young winemakers and viticulturists are realising the value of these beautiful old plantings, and they're looking after the things. So we'll get there. We're very lucky. South Australia has a unique climate, a unique geographical and geological environment. And of course, we have the huge advantage of geographical isolation. The main enemy, of course, the root disease, the little bug, phylloxera, hasn't come in. So we've excluded it very successfully for more than a century. And the way we're going, it won't be an issue. So even though I'm not saying grafting is a bad thing, in fact, grafting can be quite useful as a tool and an alternative expression, but we will have these really old vineyards. And we've got to celebrate that and make sure people understand how unique and important it is, because they do make special wine. There's a special expression, and it's just the special expression that comes from having done it sustainably and actually riding through seasonal variations.
And if you're moving in the direction of the geographical indications, etc., and words like terroir, and taking into account that whole sense of place, old vines, you're more or less suggesting, are the best expressions. Old vines that have adapted, survived, done, they're going to give you the best wines because they are giving you the best expression of that place.
Don't know whether you can categorize it as black and white as the best.
Mm-hmm.
You just know that they're gonna do some damned interesting stuff. They are going to create they're locked into actually creating a unique expression because they're there.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's the best or not, I don't know. I don't think that even comes into it.
Sure.
Because the best is just open to interpretation about what the immediate impressions are. But by and large, the beautiful old vines and old vineyards that are being nurtured and looked after today in the Barossa in particular, and there are some beautiful old plantings, of course, in McLaren Vale and up in Clare as well. So we're really lucky, eh? We've got these amazing resources, and maybe a generation ago they weren't appreciated. No, we're lucky they weren't pulled out.
Amen.
We're lucky people. We're lucky people understand how exciting and important they are, right?
Uh-huh.
And I'm inspired a lot by seeing some of the beautiful old plantings that I've seen in Europe, especially.
Well, on that point, was learning from European ancestors, etc., a big part in the shift towards old vine in Australia. I guess that would make sense. You've spoken about Spain, etc., and there would be old vines. I haven't had the pleasure of going to Europe. It's on the bucket list. A place I would love to go through: Italy, France, Portugal, Spain, etc. But how much carryover in terms of techniques, approaches to things like that, especially in your own approach to winemaking, have you adopted?
None.
None.
The appreciation of old vine is fortunately a relatively modern advent. The reason that we've got the old vines is because in a lot of instances they couldn't be bothered or couldn't afford to pull them out. So they're there just because they were there.
Chance.
And essentially, to a certain extent, it was just serendipity and good luck. In Spain, with the few very old vine parcels that we see are growing on unique sites that were immune to phylloxera. And they're growing maybe on a sand dome, such as some of the amazing vineyards up in Zamora in Spain with Tinta de Toro vines that are 250, 300 years old. But there are a lot of other regions in Spain, of course, that got phylloxera back when it was a major endemic problem in Europe and got wiped out and had to replant. And so, of course, they are by default now on phylloxera-resistant rootstock. Where I work in Humilia with Bodegas Nido, Humilia with old vine Monastrell didn't get phylloxera until the late 1970s, 100 years after the rest of its European neighbours. And they didn't realise how lucky they were in terms of they just got through that 100 years without realising how lucky they were. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, phylloxera came. They had to rip out a lot of beautiful ancient Monastrell vineyards, but there are still a few pockets of ancient Monastrell surviving that now make them realise what an incredible resource was sitting right under their nose for hundreds of years, but they didn't realise until missing the water till the well runs dry. And then, of course, now that they've replanted vineyards and reevaluated their sites, they're entering into a new phase. So to a certain extent, I think appreciation of the quality and the power and the expression of old vines is actually quite a modern phenomenon.
Okay.
It's something that we understand now, but I think a generation ago it was, what? What does that mean? So we're living in a new golden age, a new exciting golden age of winemaking.
Yeah.
Around the world.
Lucky beneficiaries of it. So back on your story. Yeah. So Robert, more or less, I think you described, gave you a leg up in purchasing your first vineyard, the one that you subsequently poured all your efforts into. And I guess that says an awful lot about Robert as a person.
Absolutely. Purchased half the grapes. I made the wine, my own wine, of course, and the other half of the fruit off the vineyard at Rockford. And it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Robert recognised that he needed beautiful old vineyards like that to augment the Shiraz palette for basket press Shiraz. On the back of the success that I had, my third vintage off that vineyard, 1996, was just an unbelievably great vintage. 96 still stands as probably one of the great 1 in 50 year vintages at Barossa. And on the back of the sort of results, we decided to actually make a special little program of Shiraz at Rockford that was like Basket Press Plus, the SVS program. special vintage selection, whatever you want to call it. And I'm pretty proud to say that I think that the work I was doing with my little parcel was inspirational for the development of that project. And so the first vintage of SVS at Rockford was in 1996. It shows a rather good year to actually initiate a project. The 1996 SVSs are still legendary, unbelievably long-lived wines. So it floors me when I look at them now and think how simply we made them and how we were just, oh yeah, it's vintage. And someone brought along, I was at dinner at Vintners a few months ago, and someone brought along a 1996 Rockford SVS Flaxman Valley, which was 50% the grapes I contributed, 50% Merv Steinert, and the wine just astonished. I don't have any bottles of that wine left in my cellar. I actually have the 1996 Hoffman still in my collection, but my 1996 Flaxman was long gone. And that sort of recalibrated me. It's like, what? Look at what we did. So, it's wonderful when you've got that two-way street going. And then, of course, the opportunity and developing the projects in Spain. Essentially, I was just taking everything that I'd learned at Rockford and translating it to a Spanish environment. And
how did that come about? Winemaking techniques. That opportunity you got in Spain. Tell me about that.
It started off because I was invited to go over and actually explore consulting to a project in southern Italy in the late 1990s. And we developed a very exciting little project in Puglia called La Corte. And I just went over as an adventure. I wanted to get back to Europe, see what's going on. And so we started a little, and again, I introduced the Rockford little individual ferment approach in La Corte, in Novoli, near Lecce, in Puglia. We ran that project I supervised that project for about 3 years. And it was great fun. And the great thing, of course, about doing a project like that is I can do that in September, October, after the pruning's finished here in the Barossa, and of course, the opposite time of the year to our vintage in the Barossa. So I could skive off and get involved in little European opportunities as part of my rest and recreation, if you would call it that. And then Spain evolved out of that, being asked to actually want to check out some opportunities in Spain. And then the Spanish projects actually came together and started in the first vintage for the two projects was 2002. And by that stage, I actually had to pull out of the projects in Puglia because I was just spread too thin. I was just trying to do too many things. And again, it was because I had opportunities. It was just too exciting. I had to bloody do it. You get, again, I'd be given an opportunity, and Rockford had given me the grounding and the sound and the baseline. And then there were a chance to go back and translate ideas and experience and enjoy Europe. And it was a great time. The early 2000s was a wonderful time in the wine business in Spain and in Europe in general. And it was just too good to resist. And I'm still doing it. So it worked. So, that we made some extremely fine wines, and they're still aging beautifully, and they're a testament to the solid, basic winemaking principles that were learnt and were established at Rockford. So the two bodegas in Spain are essentially like slightly modernised, ramped up versions of Rockford. Little open ferments, basket presses. The whole thing is essentially just an extrapolation of those original principles. And of course, the Spanish collaborators love it. So we're making bloody good wines.
In terms of making something successful, you've just outlined a very simple but interesting formula of taking base principles and applying them correctly. But if we just look at some points on your resume, in 1993, I think you got your first, it was 99 points, Robert Parker Jr., 96, correct me if I'm wrong on these, you got 100 points. And then I think 01, 02, 04, you got 100 points.
Yes.
Firstly, what's your opinion on the Robert Parker Jr. 100-point system? I've read some different things. People have different opinions, but Those 100 points is huge. 99 is unbelievable. 100's better than that. That is perfection in a bottle. Firstly, I guess, what did that mean to you? But secondly, what is your opinion on that manner of grading wines, etc.? Because it's now being adopted more or less, my understanding is universally, or at least that's all I see in places. What are your thoughts on that?
I just have to clarify a small detail.
Please do.
His Robert Parker's rating on the 1993 was actually 99 plus.
Yes.
So I didn't actually, of course, I wasn't really following this stuff. I just started getting phone calls from the trade in Australia one morning going, "Did you see this 99 plus?" And I actually thought they were joking.
Yep. So can we just clarify that 99 plus would mean it could be anywhere from 99 through to 100, but that's 100. If I got a 99 plus, I'd go, mate, just give me 100.
It was an interesting starting point. I look back at it now and it's interesting. Josh Reynolds just published a very interesting analysis of how the Barossa has evolved on Venice a week ago, actually on the back of reviewing a whole lot of Australian wines, including my current crop. And he put it rather well, because there was what happened in the mid-90s when Robert Parker first noticed what was going on in Australia. We got noticed.
Mm-hmm.
The key was we got freaking noticed. And the internet was just starting to ramp up. The path to information was starting to be challenged. Up until then, if you wanted to find out what was going on with wine, you had to read one of the newspapers or buy a magazine, and the wine journalists were the gatekeepers feeding you the information. Okay, the Wine Advocate established itself as an independent wine reviewing forum, but the internet changed everything, because that information got spread and shared in a way that was not possible with just going down the newsagents and buying a magazine or a newspaper, or being fed the opinion of a particular reviewer or journalist. So we got noticed, and it was a very important, we got noticed. Again, I hope I don't sound like I'm repeating myself, right thing at the right time, opportunity occurring at the right time. And so all of a sudden, I went from making wine in the Barossa and having my own little label and having my own little private group of retailers and private customers to getting phone calls from Europe in the middle of the night. People, suddenly realizing people all around the world had noticed what had gone on. And that was tremendously exciting. That was the awakening to the next stage.
Yeah.
So
did that catch you completely by surprise, or did you know that you had something? There's knowing you've got something good, and then I guess getting a call, being notified that you got 100 points from Robert Parker Jr. Did you know it had the potential to do something kind of great?
Caught me completely off guard.
Yeah. Okay.
I was making the sort of wine that I wanted to make. Yeah. I was making the wine strongly influenced by what I'd learned from Robert. I wanted to make a wine that wasn't a copy of Basket Press Shiraz, so I was using 100% new oak. I was taking my own path, but I had no understanding how it was going to be received. I'm pretty proud to say that I hadn't changed my approach. They're big, full-on, powerful. Some would call them high octane, whatever. But yeah, we got noticed, and Australia got noticed. The Barossa got noticed, and everything changed. And it was pretty exciting. I started, obviously, on the back of that's where the requests, well, can you come to southern Italy and have a look at some vineyards?
Sure.
Can you come to Spain to look at some vineyards? And maybe what was motivating these guys right at the very beginning is, we'll get Chris Ringland involved so he can give us the Parker factor. If that was their motivation, they were probably a bit disappointed afterwards, because I went there. My motivation was looking at the vineyards going, well, are those vineyards going to do the job? And in the end, of course, we made some lovely wines, and the wines still have a great following and a great reputation. But there's a certain point where, while you get a leg up from extraordinary recognition and reviews, you can't let those drive drive everything that you do. It'd be like being a painter and having to depend on getting the Archibald every year. What's the bloody point? Or a writer and having to get the Booker. I mean, it's a bit of a silly treadmill, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I've got to say, in retrospect, when you do get that recognition, enjoy the hell out of it. It's damn good.
Yep. Okay. And you said everything changed. So a lot changed for you, as you just described. And you said everything changed for the Barossa being noticed, being put on the map, as it were. What things did you observe in the way, I guess, global attitudes towards Australian and more particularly Barossa wines as a result of that affecting people beyond just yourself?
I think the wines were taken seriously. There was something exciting going on. People wanted to try the wines. People wanted to develop relationships with the producers, and the Barossa had always been a very important part of the Australian wine scene, but it became an international phenomenon, very on the same footing as Napa, the same footing as some of the great European areas. So I think that was a fantastic development, and it continues. What I think is interesting is that there were people who thought maybe there's a formula here, and maybe some people did. I think that's probably not the best way to approach your winemaking. No, you have to approach your winemaking from your own personal idea about what you want to express. Again, it's the entertainment business.
Sure. That's very interesting. If I can press you on that point, because you're coming at it, you're very rooted in science, methodology, process. You've made some of the best wines going around. You've worked with people who have made the best wines going around. Your scores, you're a legend. What makes a good wine? How do you make a good wine? Or let's change that. Let's go. There's rock star legendary status. Chris Ringland up here. Good wines, mediocre. Can you just paint a bit of a picture as how you fill out, I guess, the top of that totem pole down to the bottom? What goes into that?
Attention to detail.
Sure.
You've got to know your vineyard. You've got to know what the vineyard's capable of achieving. And it's vineyard. And if you don't have an understanding about what the vineyard's able to achieve, and sometimes that takes a fair bit of practice, because you've got to work with it to work out what the hell's going on. Again, I was lucky. I happened to buy an extraordinarily fine vineyard. We recognised early on was an extraordinarily fine vineyard, or potentially. But it wasn't until we, of course, worked on it to actually see the results coming through that we realised, yeah, it is. It's a damn fine vineyard. You just got to focus on that, and you've got to, again, attention to detail. The thing that makes, top great rare wine what it is compared to just everyday, what I would hate to call it, but maybe commercial wines, it's all about the motivation. What are you wanting to achieve? Are you wanting to make a great wine, or are you wanting to make a decent amount of money, or you want to make a good return for your investors? You've got different motivations. At certain levels, wines are just a good drink. Nothing more fancy than that. And you can't dress it up any more than that. You can't pretend. But you've got to decide what you want to actually do. And in my case, all the influences that occurred to me through my winemaking studies, tastings, my early winemaking experiences, being a cellar hand, tasting wines, I was inspired to want to make these big, soft, beautiful red wines that can age for decades. Now, early on, I tried some of the beautiful wines that Peter Lehman made during, the 1960s and the 70s. More recently, some of the old wines made out of Coonawarra at the same time. And you see how beautifully those wines have aged, and you have insight into what those wines were like when they were young, and how they grew the grapes and how they make the wine. And you realise on a certain level, that's a very important influence, that you've got to, if you want a beautiful old bottle of red, you've got to look after certain things to actually achieve that. I'm proud to say I've got basket press Shiraz going back to 1990 in my cellar, and the years like the 1992, 1993, just drinking magnificently now. I've been in my cellar, so they haven't moved. It's really very rewarding when you can open up a bottle of wine that you were involved in the actual making of, blending of, bottling of, and you're seeing it that far down the track, and it's a damn beautiful bottle of wine, and it makes you go, oh, we got that right. I think we worked that one out. You know, that's a relief. You've just got to, again, if I don't mean to dress it up too much, like with an artistic or an entertainment parallel. Say you're a movie maker. You want to make big Hollywood blockbusters? You want to make little independent, quirky movies? You're motivated by different things to actually achieve how you want to engage with your audience or with your customers. And wine's the same. On one level, it's just an everyday commodity that people grab from the bottle shop on the way home to have a nice, refreshing drink or something like that. And I like to think that at the top level, my wines are like, they're a grand occasion thing. It's a special bottle you bring out to mark a special occasion. And that's how they're treated. And they might call them ritual wines. A lot of my customers are buying the wines for future special occasions down the track. Big formats, maybe for a kid's 21st birthday in the future, maybe a special birthday coming up. Yep. There's nothing for me more special than a beautiful old bottle of wine to mark an occasion like that, eh? So it brings everyone together. And if it's a big bottle, it's even more grand. And if it's a good bottle, everyone gets this lovely, fuzzy, beautiful, fuzzy, warm feeling. Yeah, and you're also experiencing something that people may have experienced for several thousand years. So it's you're looking back at how the wine might have been important 2,000-3,000 years ago.
Communion almost.
Pretty damn nice feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. So. That's fascinating. You made some really interesting points there, because I've spoken to some people on this show previously about the relationship between people like yourself that pursue perfection and then this growing number of wineries falling under the umbrella of these larger corporations. And you can definitely notice the contrast in quality. As you said, for some people, it's just something you drink now, grab off the shelf, and then you've got perfection crafted by others. Do you think there's space for both in the market, or is there a bit of a struggle there between family owned or independents and big corporations? What's the landscape like?
Room for everybody. That's what the world's all about. You've got to be able to buy some cheap and cheerful wine to enjoy.
Yep. And
you've got to have the special bottles for your own personal, inspirational or special occasions. Mm-hmm. No, there's room. Look, at the end of the day, it's a bottle of wine, eh? No matter how neurotic you get about whether it's good or bad. Hello. I point out to people that sometimes I've never got involved in the wine judging stuff. I've just been too busy for that sort of thing. But occasionally you talk to people who are involved in the wine judging and they go on how hard it is and how rigorous it is. And it's not like volunteer work in the leper colony. It's bloody wine tasting. Come on, so get over it. You're tasting wine. Hello. Yeah. You're not going to give you that much sympathy for how difficult the whole thing is.
Pleasure, and maybe some intoxication at the end if you don't spit. Yeah.
And for me, look, I don't set out to make perfection. Mm-hmm. That's way too big a call. I do get neurotic about it. I worry a lot, and I worry about how my vineyard is responding and how I can read how my vineyard's responding. But at the end, all I can do is just go with the flow, do my best and try and guide it to achieve what I'm wanting to achieve. Some years that's sleepless nights and worry and anxiety. And some years it's actually anxiety for the opposite reason. This is too good to be true. This season, 2013 was like that. It was just a beautiful season. And I found myself going, are we setting ourselves up here? This is just too good. Yep. And then there are years where it's just trial after complication, after unpredictable. The funny thing is, of course, when the wine comes out well out of a difficult year, you have a huge affection for it because it's like the delinquent who came good. And then when the wine comes out well out of a great year, it's, that was going to happen. It turns into your relationship with the wine. And then every now and then there'll be a wine where you didn't know what the hell was going on. I was talking to Stephen Henschke about this, actually caught up with him at Vintners briefly over lunch on Saturday, and he brought out a glass of 5. Magnificent. And we were sharing our love of 05, because I think 05 is one of the greatest vintages off my vineyard. And we were sharing the fact that at the time 05 was not, it wasn't actually considered all that great a vintage. And we're looking at it now and we're going, well, that was pretty bloody good.
Mm-hmm.
And we also agreed, and it was really lovely when you're sharing these observations. 2007 is what we call a sleeper, because at the time everyone thought 2007 was a bit of a dud. And now good bottles of 2007 from great vineyards are like treasures. And isn't it? It's cool, eh? Sometimes it takes 10 to 15 years for a certain vintage in the Barossa to emerge from also ran status to wow.
Mm-hmm.
Why
Like
didn't
people,
I buy?
a person. Mm, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, why didn't I buy more of that? We
Mm-hmm.
see that all the time. I remember seeing that quite regularly with basket press Shiraz as well. There were years where everyone wanted to jump on it because that had been touted as a great year. And there were years that were considered to be not that good. And so there was slightly less interest. But you could always tell the real loyal customers, they were buying up irrespective, because they knew that the long-term
Trust.
was going to, it was going to provide the reward.
Three Rivers eventually became, I think, what is known today as pretty much Chris Ringland Wines. Firstly, why the evolution?
I created Three Rivers. I thought it was a catchy name, a good label.
Yep.
And when I started trademarking it around the world, I got good advice from a trademark attorney. He said, "This is taking off. You've got to register this." And they advised me to leave the United States as the last country to do the registration, and because it's the most litigious commercial economy in the world. And of course, within a week of registering trademark application in the United States, challenged by
right. Okay.
Challenged by a winery in Washington State, Walla Walla. And I've then got some very astute advice saying, don't go to court. You have registered the worldwide trademark in every country apart from the US. Go back to these bozos and say, if you want the worldwide trademark, you're going to have to buy it off me. So I sold it to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's so simple. Why go wasting money on a trademark litigation when you can sell a trademark?
Yep.
So I sold them the trademark and changed to Chris Ringland.
Happy days. Yep. And your reputation carried that forward, I'm going to assume. Chris Ringland, the name would have meant a lot to a lot of people. So did much change in terms of your branding, et cetera, as a result of that change?
Robert Parker loved the story. And for the reviews for the next 2 years, he referred to my wine as Chris Ringland, formerly Three Rivers.
Dig.
And that was enough to create a beautiful transition.
Yep.
So thank you, Robert. He was a huge supporter. He realised what I'd been through. And funnily enough, in retrospect, okay, someone might say, you can't sell Chris Ringland. You can sell Three Rivers. Oh, yes, actually, by the way, I did. You just got to go with the flow. You got to take the blows and work out strategies. And so now it's Chris Ringland Dry Grown Barossa, and even it's from the Barossa ranges, and everybody recognises that. To this day, there are a lot of people who still refer to my wine as Three Rivers. It's part of a little collection of legendary names that wine has, but at the end of that, it's Chris Ringland Dry Grown. It was maybe good to go through that process early in the piece, going through the understanding the dangers of trademark and litigation and stuff, when maybe you're onto a good thing when people start challenging your trademark.
Yeah, 100%.
It's usually a sign you're on a good thing. You have to just take it as a compliment.
And where are you at now in the scheme of things? So we're in a really interesting geopolitical landscape. You've got a lot of dealings internationally. You send a lot to the US. You do a lot in Europe, as you've explained before. Taking into account the weird and wonderful things that have happened throughout the world recently, COVID, different markets being impacted, etc. How has that affected you? And more or less, what is happening with Chris Ringland looking into the future? Big plans, big developments, or just business as usual, creating good stuff?
Business as usual. Great relationships. People with sales and interest have not been negatively influenced. We, if anything, in fact, what's maybe evolved in the last couple of years has reinforced people's desire to want to have a damn fine glass of wine.
Yeah.
And I'm more than happy to comply, more than happy to supply. Yeah. So to my delight, we're continuing. Look, we don't make a lot of wine. My vineyard can only produce 1,800 bottles of wine in a good year. So the number of people around the world who get access to those bottles is quite an eclectic group. And I continue to have great relationships with them. And they're all now part of the journey, part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Again, harping back to the entertainment aspect, every year's a new chapter.
Yep.
Every year's a new expression. And a lot of these people are cellaring the wines. A lot of these people wouldn't dare open an old bottle of the wine without calling me first and asking my permission, or at the very least, asking how long to decant it for, when I last tasted it, is it ready? It's wonderful when you've got a relationship like that with people, where they can call you up and you can have that little discussion and provide them with a bit of advice. And also, of course, I want your feedback. You need to let me know how it went to make sure that I can learn for the next time, So obviously, I miss not going to Spain. I haven't been to Spain for 2 years, but I still do the blend. I still do the blends. We air freight the wines down, and I do the blends here in Australia. Email back my plans. We have a teleconference. We discuss all the options. My Spanish partners have discovered that we're actually getting the job done more efficiently without me being there, which is gratifying. It's gratifying.
Yeah.
But no, the biggest negative for me is I don't get to do lunch in Spain. Hello.
Yeah. I can only imagine.
That's the frustrating thing. I miss Spain. I love Spain. There's a lot. South Australia and Spain have got a lot of in common, climatically, geographically, the way the people. Spanish are the Australians of Europe, even if they are too scared to admit it.
Explain that comment. Okay, relax.
It's just it's their attitude, it's their climate. They have a lot. And Australians and Spanish get on. We find it easy to get on. It's just we have a similar attitude to life. Maybe it's because of the climate. Maybe it's historically, whatever. Australians find it easy to have a good time in Spain, and Spaniards find it easy to have a good time in Australia.
Okay.
There's something special going on there. So I hope to get back sometime. Although I must admit, with the way that things are running so smoothly with the actual getting the job done, the next time I go to Spain, it's going to be entirely for leisure. So
why not?
Work can go somewhere else. But I miss it. When you go somewhere for 20 years and you get to know it so well, it's inevitable that you actually feel a bit of sadness that your ability to do so is dramatically cut short. That's how it goes. We all adapt.
Chris, I've loved hearing about your story. Now some different questions to wrap this up, considering how generous you've been with your time. What is the moment in your life or in your career that meant the most to you? Wine, or I might even open that up to non-wine. There's a moment that if you were, to look back and go, that meant more to me than anything else, that was the most special moment in my life. What was that?
It's funny, I saw that question. You actually posed that question when we were setting this thing up. And for me, that was the most difficult one to actually get my head around. I'd forgotten that you actually posed that. I don't tend to think about things in terms of those special gratifying moments. I don't know why. It's just not the way I categorize experiences. Obviously, when I look back at it, I'm just delighted and grateful that opportunities have come my way, and then I've actually been able to do things, and it's worked. That for me, that's the thing that I look back and go, wow, I never expected this. You set out on an adventure, you do your best, you try your hardest, and if it all works out, it's all well and good. No, I can't pinpoint a single thing that I would consider to be a most gratifying moment.
Sure.
It's a big collective.
And I'm going to twist that question slightly. A bottle of wine. What bottle of wine? Is there one that had an impact on you as a young person, as a developing winemaker, something that just lit you up and you thought it was ethereal? A lot of people talk about that bottle of wine. Is it the same answer? You've had too many to remember, lots of different ones, or is there something that stands out to you as the closest thing you have tasted to perfection? And it can be one of your own.
Yeah, it's a two-pronged answer, and it's actually a pretty good question. The answer that springs to mind is, say if we phrase that question as, what was the greatest bottle of wine you've ever had? My immediate answer would be the bottle of wine I opened last night. So for me, that's why you do it.
What did you open last night, out of curiosity?
I actually had a Vinho Verde last night. There's some I love these Portugal current crop 2020 Vinho Verdes.
Yeah.
Very refreshing, very good. But actually thinking further about it, there was one bottle of wine that I had when I was at that stage where I was interested in wine, contemplating or getting ready to actually head off to Australia to study wine. And I did you'd go around the wine shops and you'd explore what you were reading about the great wines of the world, what wines were considered to be the great wines of the world. And I did have a 1961 Chateau Palmer. So it was a Bordeaux, 1961 Chateau Palmer. Wasn't that expensive back in the mid-70s in New Zealand. And it was pretty damn good. It was like, yeah, if they say that's a good bottle of wine, yeah, actually it is a damn good bottle of wine. It's considered to be a great vintage and a great wine. And actually it delivered on its promise. And maybe that's inspirational too, eh? As a young winemaker, you're going, well, they're saying this is an extremely good winery. This is an extremely good vintage. This is an extremely good bottle. And you buy one and you crack it open and you go, yeah, it is. So that's pretty inspirational, eh? And for me, red wines like that are powerfully inspirational. I've had, really good white wines and really good stickies. But I still think that one sticks in my mind because that was that moment where it reinforced what I'd been reading about what was to be good, and it actually delivered in terms of the way that wine tasted and stuff like that. So it sticks in my mind, that particular wine. It might sound a bit cliche, it was only 61 Bordeaux, but it actually was pretty damn good. So.
Okay. And on something you just said, you do have a focus on reds. Is there a reason for that? Is that just focusing on one thing to do it as best you can, or you have a preference for red varietals?
Yeah, I suppose again it comes down to what I learned as a winemaker, and working with Robert and focusing on red wine, and maybe it being so different to what was really going on in New Zealand. I drink a lot of white wine. I love white wine. I love Chablis. Chablis is a bit of a personal delight and passion. But as I said, I love exploring what's going on. Love me Riesling, both German and Australian. Love me things like Vinho Verde, Tragedura. What a grape. Just how beautiful. And sometimes I love it. You love the obscure when you're in this business, the quirky things that maybe people don't appreciate. I love a beautiful aged vin jaune, those wines from the Jura, waxy and yellow and a bit oxidized and a bit quirky and damn delicious, especially with a good bit of cheese. Oh, you got to have your things that you're full-bodied red and full-bodied grand red and aged full-bodied red. There's something special, that there's no other thing quite like it. And Shiraz, what a grape. It just does it all. It's so capable of aging in that way and making such a beautiful aged expression, and it can make lovely young fresh light red too. So magic stuff.
No, it is indeed. Final question for you, Chris. If you were to give a statement of advice to a group of people as broad as somebody exploring the initial stages of their wine journey, or somebody who's been drinking it for a little while, the secret to enjoying wine, and yet you've shared so many little secrets throughout the course of this interview, even in terms of just enjoying it, drinking it with something that you enjoy eating, as you were talking about your Portuguese and your Spanish experiences, etc. But is there something that you think adds to somebody's wine experience that can be really useful of enjoying the pleasure of?
Yeah, enjoy it, In the context of a crazy, unpredictable, random universe, the fact that wine exists, I think that's pretty incredible, So for me, every glass of wine, no matter how simple the situation or whatever the situation is, like having a glass of wine, it's pretty good. So yeah, again, it's just keep it simple, like just enjoy the simplicity, I suppose, of the opportunity. But I don't like to analyze wine, and I don't like to make it any more complicated than just having maybe a really nice sensual moment to yourself. You share it, maybe you're sharing it with other people, but it's always the experience is going on in your nose and on your tongue and on your palate. It is your personal experience, and there's a lot of fun sharing it, but it's also, there's that slightly rather nice selfish feeling, of and I'm enjoying myself too. So, no, keep it simple.
Love it.
That's what gets me through. I got to tell you, I can't believe I'm in this business. I just love this. I'm covered in bruises from pinching myself. Anyway, sorry about the silly cliches. Good, mate.
No. Love cliches. They exist for a reason, and sometimes they just express ideas that you need to experience to believe or understand. Words can only go so far. Chris Ringland, you're a rock star of the wine world. You are terrific to talk to in person. You've been so generous with your time and the detail in the answers that you've given to my hopefully provocative questions. But thank you so much for joining me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this time we've spent, and I think I'm going to go downstairs and open a bottle of your wine. I might just enjoy it tonight.
Mate. Excellent, mate. I'm going to do the same. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much.
Good stuff.